I'm going to start with the first panelist, Mr. Vincent Atkins.
I'm tempted to say what my letter said, but having checked the last time and rebutted the argument by a previous speaker who said that his letter said 10 minutes, I'm afraid I can't. 10 years ago at the symposium, Heads of Government Symposium, I made the technical presentation on the role of trade in addressing NCDs. 10 years later, I'm again addressing the role of trade in fostering policy coherence in addressing the problem. I need not say what I should be speaking about 10 years from now. Simply to put in context the significance of trade in addressing NCD concerns, we need to bear in mind that Caribbean countries, by definition, are described as small, open economies, and that's a term used in the economic jargon. Open, meaning that the countries are heavily dependent on trade, as measured by the ratio of imports and exports to GDP. Of course, that ratio is a very high one in the Caribbean. Small, the share of Caribbean countries in global trade is small. As such, the countries are price takers. They have no influence on the price of their exports or the price of their imports. They have to take the price that is given. Food imports constitute a large share of the total imports of Caribbean countries. And when you assess food imports by HS classification, which is the standard way of trade classification, the bulk of the food imports lie within the section which deals with prepared foodstuffs and beverages, chapters 16 to 22 of the HS classification. And among those products are the ultra-processed foods, which, as we know, is a significant risk, NCD risk factors. So that necessarily we have to treat with the issue of trade because it is a significant component of economic activity in the Caribbean, referring to, again, to the openness and the smallness, and the fact that the trade composition, particularly on the import side, is so heavily bent towards foods which we know are significant contributors to NCD. The question then, which is what I address, my colleague will address the opportunities which arise. I will address some of the challenges. And one of the key challenges lie within the area of trade policy, and specifically trying to unravel the myth or the misperception that trade policy should be geared towards achieving economic objectives, when in reality, trade policy does have significant influence on the attainment of social objectives, including the objective of addressing NCD, the scourge of NCD within the region. With respect to specific trade policy measures, there are significant limitations on the types of measures that may be used in regulating trade. Under our multilateral trade obligations, there are prohibitions on the use of quantitative restrictions, so that governments which may wish to use quantitative restrictions or quotas, for example, or import licenses to restrict the importation of those foods which I've already said are detrimental to health, have very significant limitations in doing so. They need to meet specific requirements under the treaty obligations. There are limits on the tariffs which can be imposed on certain foods, so that you speak of the concept of the bound rates and tariff bindings. That's a limitation. There are limitations on liberalization of tariffs, particularly in the context of regional trade agreements. If you think, for example, of the CARIFCOM arrangement, the CSME arrangement, some of the unhealthy foods are produced within the region itself. But when traded among the countries of the regions, okay, good. Among the region, there is no scope for using tariff. In addition to policy constraints, there are supply side constraints, the high domestic cost of producing foods which are healthy, which of course compete with cheaper foods coming from outside of the region, but generally foods which are obesogenic, energy dense foods, which are significant contributors to NCDs. So that within the constraints of time, I have sought to address some of the constraints that trade policy faces in addressing NCDs. My colleague will deal then with the opportunities which exist in the trade area.
Thank you very much. You were almost tackled there. Continue.
Okay, so thank you. In the interest of time, so there's a PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through the PowerPoint. You'll have it circulated to you. But my presentation picks up, as Vincent said, look, exploring opportunities for greater policy coherence in support of the SDGs from a trade perspective. So just jumping straight in without any preliminaries. So it's useful that Professor Hennis, Dr. Hennis just spoke, because I can pick up from where he left off. So the 3 C's, as I'm calling them: collaboration, coordination, and coherence, right? Coherence, my panel. And what I wanted, so that's certainly from a trade perspective, so not just in terms of health, from a trade perspective, that's something that is quite important. So for example, in terms of the CCHV CMO priorities that Dr. Hennis spoke about, how many of us as health people have communicated those priorities to our missions in New York, in Geneva, in the OAS, so that they are able to act upon those priorities, to integrate those priorities into their interactions with delegations and meetings and negotiations. I saw Ambassador Radrick, they're taking furious pictures as the slides were going by, and I know he's going to put them to good use in New York. Similarly, how many of us have, from a health perspective, someone within our ministry who regularly liaises with our missions? A points person who the missions has, who when these issues come up, they know there's somebody that they can speak to in the context of understanding better what are the policies, what are the priorities, what is our national position from a health perspective. If we're looking in a very, very trade-specific context, TBT, we had a PAHO meeting in October last year, and all the health people in the room were shocked to hear that the WTO Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade is actually dealing with health matters. Nobody in the room ever had paid any attention to anything that was happening in the TBT. And I can assure you that our missions don't have a clue, not in a bad sense, but in the sense of never having been given the information to understand that we actually have an interest in terms of these issues as it relates to labeling. Poor Chile and Ecuador and Peru are getting all sorts of blows in the TBT committee. And we as CARICOM are not there supporting them and sort of pushing the agenda that we also share in terms of wanting to have labeling and these sorts of things. So I 1000% endorse what Professor Hennis, Dr. Hennis says, but in a trade context, yes? Then, sort of moving on from there, we need more active participation and engagement in multilateral front across multiple fora. So, as I said, we have to leverage our embassies on our missions in much the way that Ambassador Rattray was talking about in terms of promoting, and as Ambassador Hart would have spoken about yesterday, in terms of using the people that we have on the ground in New York, in Geneva, in Brussels, in all of these places to create spaces where we can garner support for our agenda and where we can increase understanding, because a lot of times people, you know, part of our barriers are people don't understand the issues or don't understand why we need these types of regulations, for example. And in so doing, as well, as you would have heard Ambassador Hart said yesterday as well, they had a meeting at the OAS, and what happens? Now he's identified potential persons to work with, coalition building. So from all the people that spoke at the Inter-American meeting, he now knows that, well, next time when we have an NCDs thing, I'm going to be talking to Chile. I'm going to be talking to Brazil. I'm going to be talking to these people. And equally, it doesn't have to be limited then to OAS. When we go to New York, we can say to them, we've been working with your colleagues in DC, and this is, you know, how we want to go. Then the last few points is we need more diverse, sort of linking into that, we need more diversified delegations to these different meetings. So many times, for example, TBT would just be dealt with by trade. We need to ensure that we have health persons or at least health inputs into those positions. And we also need to ensure in that regard that in terms of our negotiations, when our trade people go out, that they're integrating these positions into our negotiating positions. And it can be done. We've seen how in the Pacific, for example, they have been able to nuance their approach to EPA, to the Economic Partnership Agreement, to include some of their concerns in terms of NCD. So excluding from liberalization some of those obesogenic foods. So it can be done. And then finally, as I said, going through strategic partnerships, because we can't fight this battle all on our own.
Thank you, Nicole. And there was no KFL favoritism there. You had exactly 5 minutes. Our next speaker, Mr. Barton Clarke in agriculture.
Good morning, all. My point, firstly, let me just thank you all and so on for the opportunity and for agriculture to be here. But I don't want this to be a one-off business. I want this to be really where we are going to practice, like you said, cooperation and so on and coordination. My point of departure is the Caribbean Regional Food and Nutrition Security Policy, which supposed to ensure that all aspects of the region's food chain, food safety, public health system remains capable of providing the safe, adequate, nutritious, and affordable food for the people of the Caribbean. The policy advocates sustainable, nutrition-sensitive agricultural systems. The question becomes how much are aware that such a policy and thing exists, and to what extent and so on is it being implemented? Because quite frankly, I don't believe so. Because if that was the case and so on, that we would not be here talking about chronic non-communicable diseases and their challenges, right? Some of the barriers and so on were alluded to, and perhaps something just quickly, the limited supply, because all the long talk, this issue of sweet potatoes and yams versus wheat flour can only be addressed if there's increase in production, if there is reduction and thing in the cost the cost of production. And then also when we take into consideration the fact and think that there are small states and bigger states that you need therefore some cross-border investments so we can get the plenty from in Guyana to support the food systems and so on in Barbados, right? But in that sense, we also then need to deal with the fact that there are a whole set of non-tariff barriers that have been put in place within the Caribbean that inhibits the ability and so on to trade. Even recently, the heads of governments are reduced to arguing about the movement of honey from Trinidad to, from Grenada to Trinidad. Ridiculous. So, Right now, as a consequence of Hurricane Maria, the member states are canvassing in Washington and New York about building resilient societies. Now, that not only relates to constructing, building houses out of concrete. We need to take the opportunity to get into that space with the heads of governments to also include the issues of chronic non-communicable diseases and the agricultural agenda that is associated therewith. And that then leads us and so on to policy and advocacy, where we need to look at the empirical evidence and things that is necessary and things to inform policy. We have one or two projects going, the projects with Dr. Samuels, the initiative with Dr. Hospitalis regarding childhood obesity, but more of that is required if we are going to go forward. The legal framework, let us be bold. When China determined that it was coming into the world arena in the early 70s, it quickly realized that if there is a crisis, nobody can feed 1.3 billion people. So politically and legally, they equated food security, including the issues of nutrition, to national security. And they were, of course, something, the rest is history. When we dealt with the issues of food supply in the Caribbean in a manner that allowed us to be food secure, this is true that it was in the context of the Second World War. Why aren't we bold enough to go back there in terms of a legislative framework? All of successful agriculture across the world, the US Farm Bill, the Indian Farm Bill is predicated upon legislation. Why don't we have a legal framework within the Caribbean? Right now, the chief medical officer by law is mandated to make a report on health issues every year, not the chief agricultural officer. So that is an issue that also needs to be addressed. And when we're looking at domestic opportunities, we're advocating the use of a value chain approach, where health and agriculture is part of the discourse when it comes to building the value chain. So that when we're talking about this, we boast about the success of replacing some of the bread, some of the wheat and bread with cassava. We're doing that in Barbados, Purity Bakery is on board, etc. Right? But the health professions also need to be part of that. Because how much cassava? What is the influence of the cassava upon the nutritional quality and thing of the bread? We're now debating that after the fact. But if the health people were part of that value chain development, then that issue and thing would be resolved and thing from up front. So these are just about a couple of examples that I put on the table relative to this issue of opportunities for greater policy coherence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clarke. Your example of movement of honey is quite interesting. I suppose it's easier if the produce moves itself, like flying fish. Okay. So moving on to the next presenter, Mrs. Sharmaine Edwards in health.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So continuing in the discussion, looking at coherence, coordination, and collaboration, and looking at barriers and opportunities from a food security and nutrition perspective, I want to start with where Vincent started in terms of market access and trade liberalization, because what we have in our obesogenic environment is a spread of unhealthy commodities, such as those ultra-processed, energy-dense foods. And they are ubiquitous, they are everywhere. So another threat too is the media influence, but media can also be seen as an opportunity. But in terms of media as a threat, our children especially are bombarded with advertising and marketing, or even in the school environment, because we have the food industries supporting school activities. Our Boys and Girls Champs is sponsored by Pepsi. And And so what is the message that we are really giving? Are we giving mixed messages to these children? Also, in the search for solutions, we engage the food industry because they have ready resources available to assist. That can also be seen as an opportunity, but I'll talk to that in a little bit. But our schools have the food industry running the canteens. All right, that's what we have in Jamaica. In terms of getting the messages out from the industry, we also get pushback. You would have heard in the media just recently that the Heart Foundation is being sued by one of our major companies in Jamaica for influences based on the advertisement that I'm hoping you would have also seen in terms of the reduction in sugar sweetened beverage consumption. So the pushback is real. Our policy and legislative process is also bureaucratic and protracted. And you heard the First Lady talk about these processes in terms of getting stuff approved. So yes, we are trying, but the legislative process is very protracted. And when we do get these policies approved, we have delayed implementation. Sometimes for lack of resources, sometimes because governments change, and so there's a new focus with the incoming government. And importantly, I think we have limited marketing strategies for health messaging. Just recently in Jamaica, we participated in a Just Media campaign where the University of the West Indies engaged adolescents and built competencies in them to understand, to interpret advertising and looking for hidden messages, and then to convert that into creating healthy ads related to foods. So those are some of the threats that come readily to mind. In terms of opportunities, however, there is a policy framework that we can build on because we have been focusing on health in all policies. There are a number of interministerial collaborations, certainly with the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, and the ministry responsible for agriculture. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Office of the Prime Minister has also engaged health in terms of looking at foods and marketing and the whole trade policy. The Decade of Action on Nutrition, 2016 to 2025, with extension to 2030, I think also provides a key opportunity for us as we look at what is available from the food perspective. Civil society and academia have also become involved, and what they have done is increase the evidence of the impact of NCDs, and of course, giving more credence to advocacy and communication. The media, there is awareness because the message is out there, both the positive and the negative. And I think what that has done is created some awareness in the population. Work again done through Heart Foundation and Global Advocacy Network and Vital Strategies have indicated that parents are now more aware of what is available to their children, and they're in fact asking for a change. One of the surveys did say that they are in support of this tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. We have also engaged the food industry in terms of looking at product reformulation, labeling, and marketing restrictions. And so I think that is gonna go a long way. In terms of what is still needed, as I wind down to close, I think we really need to have some more health-sensitive trade policies. So it's not just about having foods available, but what will be the impact on health? Global governance, I think we do need some more coordination from that perspective, and then holding countries accountable to implement what we have signed onto, because we have signed a number of initiatives, but there's no implementation, and then there's no accountability for that non-implementation. We have learned some lessons. We know that commitment is needed at all levels, and sustainable commitment, not just commitment for 1 year or 2 years, but commitment ongoing. Integrated approach is always going to be needed. And then we need buy-in from all the sectors. So agriculture needs to understand that whatever is produced is going to have an impact on health, and the government and the country as a whole will be impacted. So it's not just a health issue, it's all of us issue. And so multi-sectoral coordination and collaboration is going to be important. And those are the messages I want to share.
Thank you, Mrs. Edwards. And I have kind of grouped health together in 10 minutes. And since your co-presenter went over by 1 minute, that's all I'll say. Dr. Davidson.
Okay, so I will try to stick to time, and maybe because we're here in Jamaica, we get the additional minute. So, in continuing on the discussion around barriers and opportunities for greater policy coherence, in achieving our targets for 25 by 25 and SDGs, I'd like to highlight, go straight into the meat of the matter. So one of the major barriers we found with respect to health as a lead agency is the data, the evidence. And the evidence, not just international evidence, but local evidence to support the policies that we have identified, especially in the area of the economics, the cost. So when you go to another health ministry, you have to present the data that's relevant to them, and you have to present local data. And so that was a major gap for us. Again, health very often is just not at the table in deliberations around a lot of policy issues at mental stage. And so that is also another barrier, because if you're not at the table, then you don't know, you can't even give your input as to some of the issues and the consequences. Again, leadership. So political will leadership at both the technical level and at the political level is very, very important in ensuring policy coherence, because it's through that leadership that you can engage the other agencies, whether government and outside of government as well. And then legislation, as it was mentioned before, takes a very long time. We just tabled in Parliament our Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it took 20 years to get there. And so many of the targets are about policies that we have to implement and move forward. And the policies that have actually moved forward quickly are things that are within the remit of that particular agency. For example, tax increases in some of, that was a remit of the Ministry of Finance. So, and then finally, one of the two other barriers was inadequate sensitization of the population around some of the areas related to NCDs, because it's the population that votes. They're the ones who create the manifestos that for the different political parties, at least the priorities are identified and supported. So it's important that you have adequately sensitized the population around these issues. And then finally, another area is that the Caribbean experience before, our experience in Jamaica, was that most parties were in for at least 10 years. Now we have every 5 years a change in political parties and leadership. So it means, and when the parties do come in, their manifesto is what is priority. So it's important that some of these policy issues are on that agenda. So, and again, competing priorities of other interest groups in the private sector and elsewhere can be a barrier if they're not well sensitized. So what are some of the key opportunities? So the first major opportunity we found was that with the establishment of our national committee on non-communicable diseases, that brought different players to the fore, and we were able to do some sensitization with the different government and non-government agencies. But the critical key thing that we found was when you coalesce around a particular agenda, so for example, the implementation of the FCTC, we were able to bring all the players to the table. They had a better appreciation of the issues related to NCDs. And so through that platform, we have been able to leverage a lot of the other policy issues related to NCDs, including around nutrition and other areas. So now through the investment case activity, we have actually seen where all the ministries are now talking about or having a conversation about NCDs. When we propose policies, we get greater buy-in around NCDs, and we're being invited to the table. Aspects is ensuring that you translate some of these policy messages into something that's relatable to the other ministries. So one of the feedback we got from one ministry, which is security, was that if you have me at the table, I need to see where I fit into the bigger picture. And so that was important to get them to have this on the agenda. And of course, our Jamaica Moves campaign and leadership, that actually raised the awareness about NCDs and brought more people together. So, and there were other opportunities which we had identified. Every piece of legislation, once it's tabled in Parliament, has to be debated. And so this is where health and all agencies would have an opportunity to review and give their input. So whether it be something on agriculture, health would have the opportunity to be at the table. So that was one of the critical things. So in moving forward, I think we need to sensitize our partners. We need to ensure that we translate the evidence that we have into local relatable data and evidence so that the partners can see themselves as a part of this process at the table. Very often, many of our partners can't even understand the language we're speaking. They say that we're speaking something that they don't understand. So it's not relatable. So this is why they don't implement the legislation. So I think these are some of the critical areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamaica did not need the extra minute, but then you are known for fast runners. So moving on to finance. So I'm told, Dr. Gayle-Geddes.
So good morning, everyone. As our chairman alluded, I am actually Jamaican, but I live in Barbados, and I was told my daughter, who is Jamaican, only made it to knapsack in Barbados because of her nationality. Suffice it to say, she was just happy enough to miss school one day. So it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm from the Caribbean Development Bank, and just point here. Excuse me. Oh, this way. Okay, great. Right. So the Caribbean Development Bank is a financing institution that provides development resources in grants and loans to our borrowing member countries, which consist of 19, most of which are from CARICOM. The intent of the organization is to provide resources towards systematic reduction of poverty in the region. Point here. Okay, great. I can skip this slide, I think, because I want to preach the converted. All right, so I want to identify that for the CDB, for short, or strategic plan does not have a specific health outcome. So I'm declaring my hand up front. But what we do recognize, yes, I thought it would generate that response. However, we have a strategic objective that speaks to supporting inclusive and sustainable growth and development. And perhaps I should backtrack and give you a reason for the non-inclusion of a specific health outcome. We have 19 borrowing member countries, which consist primarily of CARICOM member states that have determined, the board of directors, which are the governors are appointed by the respective administration, that it chooses that the bank should not identify that as a priority. However, our strategic objective of supporting inclusive and sustainable growth and development, we understand, is a people-centric model of sustainable development. So therefore, we cannot ignore health. So in 2016, CDB revisited the health sector, and we looked at the existing development partners operating in the area, and we determined, with the board's consent, what would have been defined as the bank's comparative advantage or available resources, and what our key stakeholders wanted us to do in this area. Importantly, notwithstanding what I said before, we have identified what we call key entry points for enhancing health outcomes in the 19 BMCs. This includes mainstreaming and addressing issues of gender equality and social inclusion of vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, whether from Dominica, Suriname, Belize, Guyana, including addressing the inclusion of persons with disabilities, among other at-risk groups. So I'm providing you with some examples because I suspect people will be approaching us or already have approached us with respect to what can we actually finance. So I'll give you 3 examples this morning. With respect to our priority area of education and training and citizen security, we have determined that the bank can finance nutrition school feeding programs because we have a huge portfolio in education and training from the early childhood right up to the tertiary level. So we have projects like UTech, TVET in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, etc. So we've determined that nutrition and school feeding support programs is an area that we can partner with our BMCs, curricular reform to include focus on healthy lifestyles, as well as reform of health and family life education, programs to encourage school gardens and physical education. So in our projects, we're looking towards building gyms and physical activity sites on the school property so that this can enhance the quality of life of our children. With respect to agriculture and rural development, the bank will support the development research on nutritious foods and the promotion of sanitary food distribution and handling systems, and of course the development of food and nutrition security strategies and action plans. In terms of strengthening evidence-based policymaking, I understood this has been stated in terms of, in several ways, whether linked to implementation deficits or the absence of data or the need for monitoring and evaluation systems to augment and demonstrate results would be very important. So the bank has said we will support research and analysis of health sector socioeconomic costs and benefits and the strengthened use of data and evidence as the basis for policy and practice. So I use those 3 as the examples today. Recently, I see the chairman drawing there, it's my last slide. We have supported NCD related areas of technical assistance for CARFO, including its regional support for its regional high-level meeting to develop a roadmap on multi-sectoral action in Caribbean countries to prevent childhood obesity through improved food and nutrition security. We've also provided some technical assistance in terms of grant resources to the Healthy Caribbean Coalition to provide capacity building of CSOs, civil society organizations, to address childhood obesity prevention. And this regional project, likewise, is supporting CSOs in the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, and Jamaica. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker, Mr. Lautrup-Nielsen. The last member of the relay team is always under a lot of pressure to keep to time. We have faith in you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to cope with the pressure and spend my 5 minutes wisely. I asked for this to be the focus of my 5 minutes because only 2 weeks ago, this event took place in the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, And as you may have noticed, the World Diabetes Foundation is also based in Denmark. This global dialogue was an outcome of a long preparatory work whereby the World Health Organization and the government of Denmark agreed to co-host this event. And if you look at the title, Global Dialogue on Partnerships for Sustainable Financing of NCD Prevention and Control. So this was not a dialogue about NCD prevention and control. It was a dialogue about partnerships for sustainable financing. I think the way we move our conceptual framework ahead defines our actions. So with that event, a lot of critical issues around the financing of NCD responses were discussed. And if you look at the supporting agencies of the event, of course, we were one of them, but we also had the World Economic Forum, we had the NCD Alliance, we had the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Association, IFPMA, and the OECD. So I believe even the group of supporting agencies showed the multi-stakeholder nature of the event, and also then signaling the need for multi-sectoral partnerships to mobilize the necessary resources. The event is part of the informal process leading to the high-level meeting. So the final report will inform the process going on in New York. If I can have the brochure on, please. Who were there? Member states were there, invited by WHO, of course. I'm not really sure how many Caribbean states made it there, but a lot of countries were there. Ministries of finance were invited with ministries of health. They were both invited. We had representatives from many ministries of finance. Can we have the next page, please? Okay, it's difficult to read. I won't go into that then, but who were else there? Regional development banks, the World Bank. Can we have the next slide, please? And the next one. Okay, the brochure is found on the website of the conference. We had the Global Fund there. We had bilateral development agencies, the Italian Development Program, the French Development Program, who are investing in NCDs. We had a lot of private sector associations there, philanthropy association from the private sector. We discussed financing sources for NCD responses, taxation, domestic budgets, domestic public-private partnerships. We discussed health system integration with the aspiration to optimize or build stronger health system able to integrate NCDs into their existing responses. That's not easy. There has been a working group, an expert group in the WHO working on this, and the report will come out shortly. And I encourage everyone to read that report. Some of the examples from the countries that are used for that integrated NCD integration and integrating NCDs into other health program areas are there. Examples from the work by Dr. Ramaya from Tanzania are there. So please read that report once it comes out. We also discussed international financing sources, of course, bilateral program, multilateral program, regional development banks, possible support, and of course, public-private partnerships from an international perspective. I believe the World Diabetes Foundation is an example of that, but there are many other examples. Many country-level examples were tabled and discussed in Copenhagen. We also discussed how to govern all this. Should we have a country-level mechanism to govern and coordinate the many different initiatives coming from bilateral, multilateral, and public-private sector partnership? It's not easy for countries to manage all this. Should there be a governing model whereby international authorities, together with government authorities, establish systems whereby we can coordinate better the resources for NCD responses? We discussed the best buys. We discussed business models, and let's look at business models from appealing to many stakeholders. It can be government who sees a business model. It can be a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Education. It can be a civil society. It can be private sector. Let's look at differentiated private sector stakeholders. Let's go forward and hopefully see these areas taken on at a regional level and a country level. Hopefully the financing aspect of NCDs will be now endorsed as something permanently part of the NCD discussion. And most finally, can we have the link to the Lancet, please? There was another highlight. I don't know if I have still 1 minute, please. There was a highlight at the event. The Lancet, can I have the Lancet link, please? The Lancet Commission on NCDs launched its series on NCDs and economics. And perhaps some people heard me saying economics yesterday. And there's a reason for that. We have, I think, the best possible analysis ever made. It's difficult to see here, but there are 5 papers. Let me just read a final remark, Mr. Chair, then I'll close. The 5 task force papers show that NCDs poverty drives and is driven by NCDs, but that financial protection from high medical costs, etc., etc. You should go into that website, read those papers. They are accessible to all. Also, there's a short remark in this brilliant document prepared on page 12. You can also read. And then finally, the WHO website, please. The WHO has its own website, who.int/Copenhagen 2018. You will see the report there, probably other material there. The brochure is there. And hopefully all this work we did to get this conference become a reality will inform and take the entire conceptualization and the work that we all want to happen at country level, national NCD responses, to a next level. I believe that was more or less 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
So in mathematical terms, you are just within the standard deviation allowed. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in congratulating the panel in sticking to time and with very little prompting. So now we have 6 minutes for questions, and I'm going to open the floor. I've just checked Twitter. No one has tweeted anything. In fact, no one has tweeted anything for the last 19 hours at that hashtag. But I'm going to open the floor. Maisha has, yes, but then you have a vested interest. Open the floor for questions first by Sir George Aline. Can we have the mic?
In 2007, the Ministers of Agriculture met in St. Anne, and they had a declaration on how they're going to address the NCDs. They had about 5 different areas in which they thought they could be useful. What's happened to that? Therefore, what is the expectation that more will happen or what you presented?
What we do know is that, and this is not even relative to NCDs, we know that they have prioritized a number of commodities for development: coconuts, roots and tubers, herbs and spice, fish, and small ruminants. The NCD issue still needs to be placed as an overarching issue on that. That is about all I can say at this juncture, I think, as it relates to this matter.
I would encourage you to look back at the 2007 St. Anne's conference of the Ministers of Agriculture. It's really very interesting in the light of what you presented.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir George. Any further questions? Professor Hospitalis?
I haven't elevated the professor yet, but...
You are now.
No, thanks. I thought it was a brilliant panel. I enjoyed everybody's outputs. Yeah, it was a very good panel. You know, my wife's a veterinarian, and she and I have debates about this problem, and she laughs at us because if you have a herd to deal with, you you simply adjust up or down the amount of food to get lean or fat bacon as you desire. But I was depressed by Vincent's explication that you cannot reduce in absolute amount how much the herd gets to eat because of these barriers. We can't actually say for the good of our people, we should be eating less and turn down the tap. You have other more nuanced ways to do it. And I was curious about several things you said, Barton, that I think need further discussion. It sounds like we need to go back to agriculture within the quoted construct. You mentioned a World War II legislative framework. I'd be curious to offline to talk about that some more. Sharmaine's point about industry running canteens. Are there policies and guidelines by which, is anybody monitoring what's going on there? I could ask more questions, but those, thank you, brilliant panel.
Thank you. Any brief responses from the panelists?
Yeah, let me.
One more comment.
One more comment, Dr. George.
So for Barbados, we do a lot of trade within the region. Most of our products, I think, are attributed to Trinidad and Tobago or their neighbor in the south. And a lot of those products are unhealthy. And I would like to know how, if interregional trade is the major driver of foods on our table, how do we start at that level? Don't try to change the United States influence and so forth, but how do we start at a local level to make sure that we do this in a correct way? Because most of our, you go to our supermarkets, we have a supermarket chain called Massey. And Massey, we have about 6 Massey stores, huge stores across the island. And those are coming out of Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of the produce is coming out of Trinidad and Tobago.
Is your question towards a particular panelist or just open to the panel?
Yes, 2 persons, Barton, Clarke, and the gentleman, I can't, with it, yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'll let them respond briefly.
Let me put in context the presentation. Nicole and I presented on trade. My focus was on the constraints to using trade, and she addressed the opportunities. Now, I can certainly use each of the constraints that I have pointed to and indicate areas of opportunity. For example, when I said that there are limitations on the use of tariffs, it is simply because in the context of our multilateral trade agreements, there's a maximum, there's a bound rate that you can apply, that you cannot go over. But within the bound rate, you can adjust tariffs on products. Let me be very specific. In the Caribbean, within CARICOM, on most agricultural products, the highest level of tariff agreed under the common external tariff is 40%. That's at the CARICOM level, what's agreed within the CSME. However, under our multilateral trade arrangements, we can go as high as 100% tariff. I'm suggesting, and for some products, we can go even much higher, as much as over 200%. So that I pointed to a constraint, which is the maximum, but within that, you can adjust tariffs to make a difference between products which are considered healthy and those which are considered unhealthy. If, for example, you identify a particular product as being an ultra-processed food, obesogenic, you have the flexibility to apply the maximum tariff of 100% if you so desire. And similarly, if you consider a particular product to be a contributor to healthy lifestyle, you can either put a 0 tariff or a very low level of tariff. So there are constraints, but certainly there are things that you can do within those constraints. And similarly, when we spoke of the bottlenecks, I spoke of the bottlenecks, the fact that we are very high producers of food compared to the cheap imports of energy-dense foods. But even with that constraint, there is limited flexibility to grant subsidies, incentives for the production of those foods which are considered to be to be healthy. There are incentives in the form of credit, so that, again, there are constraints, but then those constraints may be managed in the interest of addressing NCD concerns.
Vincent, I'm going to ask you to pause there and just ask Nicole, do you want to give any comment to that? No?
No, I'll give it to you.
Okay, sure. Sure.
The issue of tariffs, of course, as defined by Vincent, doesn't apply to produce coming from a Caribbean state to another Caribbean state. There's outside the CARICOM. There are no tariffs and so on. The matter of, you know, inappropriate foods coming from Trinidad, within the CARICOM mechanism, there's some very active participation by the chief veterinary officers who have established protocols for examination of plants regarding movement of meat and meat products and so on within CARICOM. Recently, they approved movement from the various poultry houses within the Caribbean. Similar does not apply as it relates and so on to the crop stuff. What applies and things are the standards, which are the CARICOM standards established and things by CROSCU regarding the quality of the various produce. So those are then addressed by the National Standards Bureau in their daily operation at the ports. So perhaps those standards don't have the benefit of NCD criteria built into them, and that is an adjustment which will be necessary. We came across a similar instance recently when, as a consequence of some diligence by a university student in engineering in St. Augustine, we realized that coconut water had some unacceptable coliform levels. We then engaged Coreri, CARFA, SRC in Jamaica, taking samples from 4 or 5 countries, from the side of the road, from the supermarkets, etc. And we realized, yes, look, there is definitely a problem. We convene all the stakeholders, the processors, the farmers, the ministries, etc. And then we arrived at a mechanism to deal with this, including adjustment to the coconut water standard. This is an example, to my mind, of how the various bodies, health, agricultural standards, can work together in order to be able to address particular issues. And we therefore need the case of NCDs as a driver for that kind of intervention across the Caribbean. Thank you.
Mr. Clarke, thank you very much.
Just sorry, Kenneth, just to mention, just quickly in terms
30
of
30
seconds. There's a new standard coming out of Codex that actually speaks to NCD. So now in terms of packaging standards, you're going to have NCD criteria included. So that's a possibility that CARICOM can.
Thank you, Nicole. That was less than 30 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, would you believe that we are 20 seconds?
So I just wanted to respond a little to the food industry in the schools. The arrangements were made at the level of the school boards. What we find also is that with the new global school-based student health survey, our levels of obesity in our boys has doubled.
Oh, wow.
And so with that, the Ministry of Education working together with the Ministry of Health, we have actually drafted a school nutrition policy, which will address some of these marketing issues, foods available to children, foods available for sale in school. So hopefully by the next school term in September, we should have something rolling out island-wide.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been a very engaging audience, but we are a healthy audience and we are therefore due a health break.